The day my son mocked me for not going to college, I walked into my office and was handed a pink slip. It wasn't the first time I'd faced rejection, but it was the first time I truly realized how much I'd built for myself. A dusty old pen, a relic from my first job, now felt heavier than ever. That day, I bought the company that fired me. Ever had a moment that made you rethink everything? Share your thoughts. John Bishop sat in his favorite armchair, the heat of the Texas afternoon pressing against the windows. His house in Austin was quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the family clock on the mantel. He sipped at his now cold coffee, staring out at the shimmering sunlight that filled the room. The past few weeks had been difficult, but today, everything felt unusually still. Then the door creaked open and Matt, his 28-year-old grandson, walked in. Matt threw himself onto the couch, not even bothering to acknowledge John's presence with a greeting. John felt the air shift immediately. Matt's typical arrogance was thicker today. "So what's all this drama about?" Matt asked casually, slinging an arm over the back of the couch. "You're acting like you're running out of time." John didn't answer at first. He looked at Matt, his face unreadable. Over the years, he had grown used to Matt's inconsiderate behavior, but something about today felt different. Matt wasn't just dismissing him, he was mocking him. The nerve! "Don't be so dramatic." Matt continued with a smirk. His words cut deeper than John expected, and his heart tightened in response. It wasn't just the words, it was the complete disregard for respect for everything John had built for this family. It felt like a betrayal. John's hand clenched around his coffee mug, his grip tightening as anger surged within him. His voice was calm but cold when he finally spoke. "That trust I set up for you, it's gone. I'm cutting you out." Matt froze his face, showing an expression of disbelief. "What are you talking about? I mean exactly what I said. You don't deserve it. You've shown me enough." Matt stood up from the couch, visibly frustrated now. "You can't do that. What the hell is this about? We're family." John stood tall, his decision final. His hand brushed the family clock as he passed it, the ticking seeming louder than ever. The clock, a gift from his late wife, had been a constant in his life, but now even it felt like a symbol of everything slipping away. "I can do whatever I want with my own money," John said, voice steady but sharp. "I built this and I'll decide what happens to it." Matt's face twisted with anger, but John didn't flinch. He wasn't backing down. He couldn't. Matt stormed out, but John didn't feel any relief. The silence in the room was deafening. The weight of his decision hit him, but there was no turning back. The family dynamic had shifted, and it wasn't just about money, it was about respect, control, and power that he feared he'd lost over the years. As the door slammed behind Matt, John stood there staring at the clock once again. The time, once a marker of moments spent with family, now felt like a countdown. One he didn't know how to stop. John sat back down, his mind racing. He wondered for the first time in a long while whether his decision would sever the last threads of family connection. Would Matt ever forgive him? And even if he did, would it matter? John didn't know. But one thing was certain, he couldn't undo what he'd just done. The family he'd worked his whole life to protect now felt like it was slipping through his fingers. John sat in his study, the cool hum of the air conditioning barely cutting through the heavy silence that seemed to hang over the house. The once comfortable space now felt more like a tomb. Each breath John took a reminder of the decision he had made. He had never been one to dwell on things, but now as he scrolled through the pages of his financial accounts, doubt gnawed at him like a persistent hunger. He had always been meticulous, checking the books regularly, knowing where every penny was going, but today something felt different. Something wasn't right. As he sifted through the transactions, his eyes caught a few entries that made his stomach churn. Small transfers, just a few $1,000s each, had been made from the joint account over the past few months. They were marked as personal expenses, but there was no clear explanation. No bills, no receipts. Just money moving in and out of the account with no apparent reason. John leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He had always trusted Matt to some extent, but now looking at the account statements, he wondered just how much trust he had placed in the wrong person. Was Matt taking advantage of him? Was this all part of some larger plan he hadn't seen until now? He didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was piling up piece by piece. The odd phone calls, the strange behavior, the distant look Matt had in his eyes when they spoke about the future. John had seen these signs before in business dealings, but to see them in his own family, that was something he couldn't ignore. As he clicked through another transaction, the sound of his phone ringing broke the silence. It was Samuel Turner, his old friend and trusted advisor. "John, it's Samuel. I thought I'd drop by." "Need to talk about something important," Samuel's voice came through gruff, but steady. "Come on over," John replied, his voice hoarse from the stress. He hung up the phone and stared at the screen for a moment longer. His mind raced as he wondered if Samuel would have any insight into the mess he was finding himself in. Samuel arrived shortly after, his thick frame filling the doorway of John's study. His gray hair and weathered face were a testament to the years of experience he carried with him. Samuel had always been the kind of man who knew how to handle things both financially and emotionally. He had been a friend, a mentor, and an unwavering presence in John's life. "Thought I'd stop by and check on you," Samuel said, settling into the armchair across from John. "You seem a bit on edge, my friend." John didn't waste any time. He pushed the laptop towards Samuel, pointing to the screen. "I've been looking through the family accounts and I found something strange. Matt's been moving money out of the account without any clear explanation. It's happening too often, and I'm starting to get a sinking feeling in my stomach." "What do I do?" Samuel leaned forward, his sharp eyes scanning the screen. He didn't say anything for a moment, just tapping his fingers on the desk, deep in thought. I see," Samuel finally said, his voice steady. "You've done the right thing by keeping track of it. This isn't something you should ignore, John. If Matt is involved in this, you need to act fast." John felt his chest tighten at the thought of confronting Matt. He wasn't sure he was ready for that. It would break his heart, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he had no choice. The trust he had in his family, the foundation of his life, was crumbling before his eyes. Samuel continued, his tone calm but firm. "This is about protecting your legacy, John. You've worked too hard to let someone, especially someone close to you, jeopardize everything you've built. You need to get ahead of this. You need to gather evidence, cover your tracks, and prepare for the worst." John nodded slowly, the weight of Samuel's words sinking in. He had always prided himself on being in control, on knowing where everything stood. But now, with the lines between family and business blurred, he wasn't so sure anymore. "I'm not sure how far Matt's willing to go," John said quietly, "but I can't sit back and wait for it to all fall apart." "You've got the right mindset," Samuel said, placing a hand on John's shoulder. "The first step is protecting what's yours. You'll need to make sure everything's legally secured, and you can't afford to be sentimental about it." John sat back, his mind racing as he processed everything. Samuel was right, of course. He had to protect what he had left, even if it meant making difficult decisions. The trust he had once set up for Matt, the one that had been a gesture of love, was now a ticking time bomb. As the conversation turned to strategy, John's thoughts wandered back to Matt. The way he had spoken earlier, so dismissive and cold, still stung. The bond that had once been so strong now seemed fragile and fractured. By the end of the conversation, John had made up his mind. He couldn't stay passive any longer. He would have to cancel the trust no matter the consequences. He had no choice but to protect his legacy, even if it meant risking his relationship with his own flesh and blood. But as he sat there staring at the screen, a nagging feeling tugged at him. He wasn't sure if he was ready to lose everything, even if it was for the right reasons. John sat alone in his study long after Samuel had left. He turned his attention back to the family clock on the wall, its steady ticking almost deafening in the silence. With one last glance at the transaction history on his computer, John made his decision. He would cancel the trust, but he couldn't shake the fear of what it would mean. Would it tear the family apart? Would Matt ever forgive him? The weight of his decision hung heavy in the air as the clock ticked on, marking the passage of time he wasn't sure he had left. John stood at the entrance of the office building, his fingers instinctively brushing the cracked face of the family clock that sat in the corner of his desk. It had been a gift from his wife years ago, and he had never noticed the tiny fracture in its glass until now. The damage felt symbolic of the situation he was in, the once strong and unbroken family bond. now strained and in danger of shattering. Inside the office, Samuel Turner waited, his face unreadable. He was a steady presence, the kind of friend John could always count on. But today, even Samuel's usual calm couldn't cut through the tension in the room. "You're sure about this?" Samuel's voice was low, but John heard the hesitation. John didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at the pile of legal documents on the desk, his mind racing. He had never wanted it to come to this, to destroy the very thing he had worked so hard to build for his family. But Matt's actions had forced his hand. The transfers of money, the secrecy, the blatant disregard for his authority, all pointed to a betrayal that could not go unchallenged. With a sigh, John picked up the pen that sat on the desk in front of him. His hand trembled ever so slightly, but he didn't allow it to stop him. He had come this far. There was no turning back now. He needed to take control of what was his before Matt destroyed it all. "This is the only way," John muttered as he signed his name on the dotted line. The ink dried quickly, sealing his fate and the future of his family. Done, he whispered, his voice barely above a whisper. The weight of the words hung in the air like an unspoken truth. Samuel didn't comment. He simply nodded, picking up the stack of papers and handing them to John. "Now we wait," he said, his tone somber. "Matt won't take this lightly." John ran a hand over his face, feeling the exhaustion seep through his bones. His eyes flickered back to the paperwork in front of him, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The guilt was already starting to creep in, sinking into his chest. What had he just done? The sound of the clock ticking in the corner seemed louder than usual, like a constant reminder of the decision he had made. He had always prided himself on his ability to make tough choices, to be the one who could always be counted on. But now, in this moment, he wasn't sure anymore. He had just sacrificed his relationship with his only grandson, all because of money and a betrayal that was too deep to ignore. As they left the office, John's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out with a sinking feeling, seeing the name on the screen, Matt. His thumb hovered over the answer button, but he hesitated. What could he say? What was left to say? Samuel, walking ahead, glanced over his shoulder. "Answer it, John." But John couldn't bring himself to do it. He stood there staring at the phone as it vibrated in his hand. The weight of what he had done, the rift that had just been torn open in his family, felt almost too much to bear. He could hear Matt's voice in his head, full of anger and confusion, but also of betrayal. This would destroy their relationship, but it seemed there was no other way. Maybe it had been inevitable all along. But what was he going to do now? Could he ever repair the damage? Would Matt ever forgive him? John exhaled sharply, and without answering slipped the phone back into his pocket. The decision had been made, but the aftermath, the consequences were still unknown. Would this be the beginning of the end? Or the beginning of a new chapter for his family? As he walked down the steps of the office building and into the cool autumn air, John couldn't shake the unease settling in his stomach. He knew he couldn't turn back, but as the door closed behind him, he wondered just how far this decision would take him. John pulled into the small diner's parking lot on the outskirts of Austin. The sky was overcast, and the crisp autumn air clung to him as he stepped out of his car. He felt a knot in his stomach, a lingering unease that hadn't left him since he made the decision to cancel Matt's trust fund. But today he wasn't here to second-guess himself. He was here to figure out what to do next, and he trusted Samuel Turner to help him make the right choice. As he walked inside, the bell over the door jingled softly, and John spotted Samuel sitting at a corner booth, his familiar silver hair gleaming under the soft light of the diner. Samuel had always been the steady force in John's life, a man who had seen it all and always knew what to say, even when the world felt uncertain. John Samuel greeted him with a smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. The years had made him slow to smile, but when he did, it was a quiet assurance. Samuel John nodded as he slid into the booth opposite him. "Thanks for meeting me here." "No problem at all," Samuel said, his voice steady. "What's weighing on you, John?" Placed his hands flat on the table, feeling the cool surface beneath them. His eyes darted to the half-empty cup of coffee in front of Samuel, then back to the man himself. "It's Matt," he said quietly. almost as if speaking the name aloud would make the situation more real than it already was. I've been going over everything. The transfers, the phone calls, the secrecy. I don't think I can just sit back anymore. Samuel didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at John with a knowing gaze, his fingers tapping lightly against the rim of his coffee cup. Then he leaned forward, his tone serious. Matt's up to something, you know that, but you don't need to face this alone. Samuel's words were a quiet balm grounding John in the midst of the storm swirling around him. We can use the law to protect what you've worked for, John. There's a way to keep your assets safe. John's breath hitched slightly. What's the first step? His voice was low, but there was a quiet determination in it that surprised even him. Samuel's eyes flickered over to the edge of the table where John's old family clock sat. It had been a gift from his late wife, and it had always been a symbol of the family's unbroken unity. But now, with the crack running down its glass face, it seemed to echo the fracture in his relationship with Matt. First, we make sure no one can touch your assets without your consent, Samuel said, his voice like the steady hum of a machine built to endure. A charitable trust. We can set up a foundation, something that would be for the benefit of the community, but one that keeps control out of Matt's hands. John nodded slowly, the idea taking root in his mind. A charitable trust. He repeated the words as if testing them on his tongue. That could work. I want to make sure he never gets access to what I've built. But I need to be sure this will hold up in court, that I won't regret it. Samuel's gaze never wavered. You'll have to be thorough, and we'll need a lawyer who specializes in this type of work. But it's possible, John. We'll make sure the trust is rock solid, and we'll make sure Matt can't exploit it. The weight of the decision settled on John's shoulders like a heavy coat, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't alone in this. He had someone who understood the fight he was facing. Let's do it, John said, his voice firm. Let's make it happen. Samuel smiled this time with a touch of warmth. I'll handle the legal details. You just focus on keeping everything above board. But remember, John, this won't be easy. Matt won't back down without a fight. He's not the type to let things go. I know, John said, his gaze dropping to the clock again. His fingers hovered over the crack in the glass, tracing the sharp line, as if he could will the damage to vanish. But the crack remained, just as the rift between him and his grandson had. The thought of what was coming next, a long drawn-out battle for everything he had worked for, felt heavier than anything he had faced in his life. As the conversation turned to logistics and legalese, John's mind drifted to Matt. The young man had always been ambitious, but his ambition now felt dangerous. The signs were all there: Matt's increasing secrecy, his defiance, his disregard for John's authority. The trust fund wasn't just about money anymore. It was about control, power, and what Matt was willing to do to get it. John's heart sank as he realized how far Matt had already gone. But the path ahead was clear. He would protect his family's legacy, no matter the cost. And just as John was about to voice his thoughts, his phone buzzed in his pocket. The familiar name on the screen made his stomach drop. It was Matt. Do you want to take it? Samuel asked, raising an eyebrow. John shook his head, not trusting his voice. He let the phone ring, the sound of it echoing in the quiet diner. He wasn't ready to speak to Matt, not yet. Not until he had a plan in place. Let it go to voicemail, John muttered, his eyes darkening with resolve. This isn't over. The phone stopped ringing, but the weight of what was to come pressed down on John, heavier than he'd ever felt before. He knew that the battle was just beginning, but for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to fight. John sat down at the small corner booth in the diner, the dim light casting long shadows on the table. Samuel Turner, his old friend and trusted mentor, was already waiting. The scent of coffee hung in the air as John slid into the booth, feeling the familiar weight of anxiety on his chest. The issues with Matt had reached a boiling point, and he knew it was time to take action. John, Samuel greeted him with a quiet smile. You look like you've been carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. I think I am, John replied, leaning forward, his hands resting on the table. Matt's been up to something. I can feel it, and I can't ignore it anymore. Samuel listened carefully, his eyes sharp, as John laid out his concerns. I've looked through the finances, Samuel. transfers, secretive behavior. It's all pointing to something. Samuel nodded slowly, his face serious. It's time to take control. You don't have to face this alone. John looked at the clock sitting on the table between them. The crack down its glass was a reminder of how fragile things had become. I'm going to pull the trust, John said quietly, his voice firm. Matt can't keep doing this. Samuel's eyes were steady. That's a big move, but it's necessary. We'll set up a foundation, a charitable trust. That way Matt can't touch your assets. John sighed, the weight of the decision heavy on his chest. But what about the fallout, Samuel? What's this going to do to the family? Samuel paused, considering the question. You can't let that fear hold you back. You have to protect what you've built, John. Sometimes the right thing to do is the hardest thing to face. John picked up the clock, his fingers brushing over the crack in the glass. I'm doing this for the family. I just don't know if I can fix what's broken. Samuel's voice softened. It's a fight, John, but I'll help you through it. John nodded. He wasn't sure if he was ready for the consequences, but he knew one thing for sure: the time to act was now. As he looked down at the phone buzzing in his pocket, he felt a surge of determination. The call was from Matt. John let it ring out. He had made up his mind. The battle for his family's future had just begun. John sat in the courtroom, his back straight and his hands folded neatly in his lap, the cold winter air seeping in through the high windows. The atmosphere was heavy, charged with the tension that had been building for weeks. Today, the moment he'd been waiting for had finally arrived. The legal battle over his family's trust was about to reach its conclusion, and he was prepared for whatever outcome. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as the judge entered, signaling the start of the final proceedings. Matt sat across from him, his face pale and tight with frustration. The once confident young man who had so easily mocked him just months ago now appeared deflated, stripped of the arrogance he'd once worn like armor. His lawyer sat next to him, scribbling notes, clearly trying to find a way out of the corner they had backed themselves into. But there would be no escape today. The judge, a stern woman with an air of finality in her voice, addressed the court. After reviewing all the evidence presented, I have come to my decision. John's heart thudded in his chest. He'd gathered the proof, every piece falling into place: the suspicious financial transactions, Matt's secretive phone calls, the covert meetings he'd tried to hide. The documents were airtight, and Samuel Turner had been instrumental in guiding him through the legal maze. The decision now rested with the court, but John knew deep down that the truth had already been laid bare. Matt Bishop, the judge, continued, the court has ruled that the family trust is officially null and void. The terms will not be reinstated and no further claims will be accepted. This decision is final. A sharp silence settled over the room. John's breath caught in his throat, but he didn't let himself react. He had known this moment was coming, but hearing it aloud, knowing that it was over, was a different feeling altogether. The battle had been won, but the cost had been high. His son's betrayal had left a permanent mark, one that no amount of money could heal. Matt, who had been staring at the table in front of him, looked up in disbelief. His face flushed with anger and humiliation. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat, his lawyer leaning in to whisper something to him. His fist clenched at his sides, but no words of defiance or plea for mercy came. The court had already spoken. John exhaled slowly, the weight in his chest beginning to lift. The years of strain, the sleepless nights spent worrying about what Matt might do next, now seemed like distant echoes of a life he was slowly moving away from. He glanced over at the judge, who nodded once, signaling the end of the session. As the gavel struck, the reality of the situation settled in. The trust had been canceled and Matt had lost. But even in his victory, John couldn't shake the sadness that lingered. His relationship with his grandson, once so full of promise, was over. There would be no rebuilding the bond they'd shared. The foundation of their family had cracked, and no amount of legal paperwork could fix it. As the court session came to a close, John stood slowly, his movements deliberate. He could hear Matt's muttered curses behind him, the sound of his lawyer's voice trying to calm him down, but John didn't turn back. He didn't need to. The battle was over, and the war had taken its toll. Walking out of the courtroom, John felt a strange sense of relief, but also a deep sadness. The life he had worked so hard to build, the family he had sacrificed so much for, was slipping through his fingers. Yet in the cold light of day, he knew he had made the right choice. He had protected what mattered most: his legacy, his assets, and the future of his family. John reached into his pocket and pulled out the family clock, the one that had been sitting on his desk for years. It had cracked during the darkest moments, just as his relationship with Matt had. But now, as he held it in his hands, it was whole again. It wasn't the same as before, but it would do. It symbolized the end of an era and the beginning of something new. As he stepped into the cold winter air, the sound of footsteps behind him faded into the distance. Matt had lost, but John had gained something too, the closure he had been searching for all along. John sat in the quiet of his home, spring sunlight streaming through the windows. It had been a few weeks since the court ruling, and while the battle over the trust had ended, the emotional aftermath lingered. He had begun to clear out the remnants of the past, removing old furniture that held memories of the conflict with Matt. The house felt different now, emptier, but also ready for something new. The phone buzzed on the table, the name Matt flashing on the screen. John didn't answer. The calls had been coming non-stop since the court case. First they were apologies, then pleas for forgiveness. Now they were accusations. John had long since stopped picking up. His heart couldn't take it anymore. He walked out into the neighborhood, the cool spring air filling his lungs. Passing the park, he noticed a group of volunteers setting up for a food drive. The simple act of helping, of giving back to the community, called to him. It felt right away to step away from the pain and rebuild what had been lost. He approached one of the volunteers, offering his help. They quickly put him to work sorting through boxes of donations. With each small task, John felt lighter, more at peace. It wasn't about the money or the legal victory. It was about doing something meaningful. For the first time in months, he wasn't consumed by regret or anger. He was doing good. That evening, Samuel Turner stopped by. Seeing the empty walls, the calm in John's eyes, he smiled. "I see you've been busy." John nodded, feeling the weight of the last few months start to lift. "I'm learning," he said. "It's not about holding on anymore. It's about moving forward. And I think I'm ready." As they sat together talking about the future, John felt a quiet hope blooming inside him. The trust may have been destroyed, but in its place he was building something more valuable: peace. The clock on the wall, once broken and now repaired, seemed to symbolize that. The cracks were still there, but they no longer defined him. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, John felt like he was on the right path. John stood at the front of the room, watching the guests at the community fundraiser mingle, laughing and talking. The warm spring air filtered in through the open windows of the event hall, and the quiet hum of voices filled the space. It was a new beginning for him, and it felt like the world was finally starting to settle into place. The clock on the wall, once cracked and broken, now ticked steadily, a symbol of time restored. It had been fixed just a few weeks ago, a small but meaningful gesture to mark the end of a chapter in his life. As John glanced at the clock, he couldn't help but smile. He was no longer living in the past, clinging to old wounds. He had moved forward. It was an odd feeling, but a welcome one. He had spent so much time consumed by anger, regret, and loss that he hadn't realized how much that had drained him. Now, standing at this event, seeing the people who had come to support his cause, he felt an overwhelming sense of peace. He turned to Samuel Turner, who had been with him every step of the way through the legal battle, and now in this new chapter of his life. Samuel stood by, watching the crowd with a contented smile on his face. "Looks like it's all coming together," Samuel said, his voice deep with satisfaction. John nodded, his heart full. "It feels right, more than I thought it would." They had spent weeks organizing this fundraiser, using John's assets to create a community foundation that would help those in need, offering scholarships, grants, and support to the people of Austin. It was more than just charity. It was about healing, about giving back in a way that went beyond money. It was about restoring the bonds that had been broken, finding a new purpose, and helping others. As the event proceeded, John felt a warmth spreading through him. People were engaged, they were connecting, and they were hopeful. This was what life was about, he realized. Connecting with others, giving, and finding a way to rebuild what had been lost. It wasn't about material wealth or what he had once thought mattered. It was about sharing what he could, and in turn, finding a peace that transcended everything. Later in the evening, as the last of the guests began to leave, John stood alone for a moment, watching the room empty out. His eyes moved to the clock on the wall. It was a quiet moment, a reflection on how far he had come. He had rebuilt himself not just in terms of his financial standing, but in his heart. The pain and regret had lifted, replaced by something more solid, something lasting. Samuel came up beside him, offering a hand on his shoulder. "You've done something good here, John. Something lasting." John smiled, his face softened with a mix of gratitude and contentment. "I feel like I've finally started living again," he said quietly. The next chapter of his life had begun not with a grand gesture, but with a quiet certainty that he was doing the right thing. His family's past had been full of conflict, of mistakes and hurt. But now he had the opportunity to leave something far greater behind, a legacy of compassion, of giving, of healing. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was ready for whatever came next. And so as he left the event hall, the final symbol of the clock, the one that had been broken and mended, was a reminder of the journey he'd traveled. The past was behind him, the future was his to shape. The clock ticked on, and with it, John's new life began. John stood at the edge of his garden, watching the setting sun bathe everything in a soft golden light. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked steadily, its hands now working together in perfect harmony, much like his life after all the turmoil. It wasn't just the pieces of his past that were mended. His soul had found peace too. Sometimes it takes losing everything to realize what truly matters: family integrity and the power of rebuilding. It's in these quiet moments of healing that we find the strength to move forward. Has life ever handed you a second chance in disguise? I'd love to hear your story in the comments.